Presentation is Intersections of Justice, Social Movements, and Media, Black Lives Matter, and I'm Julie.
I'm Stephanie.
So in the summer of 2013, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, 3 community organizers, Alicia Garza, a domestic worker rights organizer in Oakland, California, Patrice Cullors, an anti-police violence organizer in LA, and Opal Tometi, an immigration rights worker in Phoenix, Arizona, founded the Black Lives Matter movement in cyberspace, giving it the hashtag Black Lives Matter. In 2016, black men made up about 6% of the US population, but comprised 33% of unarmed people killed by police. So our contribution to the overall research is to examine the political process in a contemporary social movement. And our purpose for the research is to examine the ways in which social movements achieve their goals and engage in public sociology. Public sociology is how research, like the implications that research has for the real world, how our research can be applied to things that people know.
All right. In our previous literature, we looked at the news media and criminal justice responses. In news media, the police accounted of a situation is what is reported on, and the reports are rarely ever questioned. Since the media takes the police accounts of what happened, the police can add details that can demonize the victim. Victims who are black receive much less positive attention, if they receive attention at all, and are often perceived as subhuman. Andrews and Karen conducted a study to find what causes social movements to gain media attention while others do not. The findings in this research show that news media is more likely to report on organizations that have local social movement activity, large-scale social movement action, and demonstrations and other public events. The theory we use for our research is the political process theory. We focused on the processes of collective action in a political struggle. Rather than exclusively examining social movement resources or the organizational structure, this theory emphasizes the political opportunities, mobilization, leaders, communication, framing, and protest.
So for our methods, we conducted a case study of 6 cases of unarmed black men who have been killed by police since 2013. We did this through, originally we found a very large data set that was everyone who's been killed by police since 2013. There was thousands of entries on it. We narrowed it down to unarmed black men who had been killed. And from there, we entered it into a database called Eleframe, who has tracked every Black Lives Matter demonstrations since Black Lives Matter has become a thing. We kept cases that had more than 5 protests, which left us with 11 total cases. From there, we looked at the police department ratio of diversity to the ratio of diversity of the city, and we took the most diverse and the least diverse police forces and ended with 6 total cases.
So Jonathan Farrell got into a car accident, and while he was searching around for help, a woman called the police and reported that a suspicious man was outside her home. When police arrived, Farrell ran towards them, and one officer used his stun gun, and the other officer shot him 12 times, and he immediately died.
Ezell Ford was a 25-year-old who was walking down the street in LA. Police believed that he looked suspicious, so they stopped him, but the reason he looked suspicious could have been the fact that he had the mental capacity of an 8 to 10-year-old. Police claim that Ford tried to grab their gun, which resulted in a scuffle, and police shot him, which resulted in his death.
Eric Garner died after he was placed in a chokehold after police reported to the scene of him selling untaxed cigarettes. And while he was placed on the ground, he could be heard saying the words, "I can't breathe."
Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old in Cleveland who was wielding a BB gun outside of a recreational center. A 911 caller reported that he could be a kid and that it could be a fake gun, but this was never relayed to the police. Within 1.5 to 2 seconds of arriving on the scene, the officer shot Tamir, resulting in his death. A later police report said that the police car was only 10 feet from where Tamir was standing when he was shot.
Michael Brown was walking down the middle of the street with a friend when Officer Darren Wilson approached and yelled for them to get out of the street. After a tussle between inside and outside of Darren's police car, Brown ran away, and as Wilson pursued him, shots were fired, and as many as 10 shots, and resulted in Brown's death.
Tony Terrell Robinson was reportedly jumping in and out of traffic during a mental break. He was also acting erratically at a friend's house. When the police were called, they came to his apartment and broke down the door, got into an altercation with him, and shot and killed him.
Move over here a little bit. So as you can see, she explained already a little bit, but our chart shows each name of the case, their location, the population percentage of white in the whole city itself, and the police department's population of white, their difference, and the number of AP stories we used. As you can see, the top 3 are the least diverse between the police department and the whole percentage of populations white in that city. And the last 3 are the least diverse. We found it interesting that Los Angeles PD was the only one that had more diversity, actually at 14%. And then Michael Brown and Ferguson, he had 53% less diversity. Now we added St. Louis to this because Ferguson could be a suburb. It's like a suburb of St. Louis. So just to compare the figures.
So in our methods, we used different sources of data. The first were Associated Press stories that we accessed through the database LexisNexis. We used Mapping Police Violence. That was where we got our original data set with everyone who's been killed by police. The record of the protests was through the website Eleframe. We also used Department of Justice documents as well as documents from the Census Bureau. We use this data to examine pro-victim and pro-family statements. So that's something like if the NAACP files a lawsuit over the victim, that would be a pro-family statement or something like that. And then we use criminal justice system case and personnel outcomes. So if there was any grand jury decisions, if the grand jury was even used, if any police officers were put on desk duty, resigned, fired, etc. We use population by race and police force by race. And then we also examined Department of Justice investigations and allegations, as well as social movement organizations that became involved during the case. So the NAACP, ACLU, different things like that. And we also looked at circumstances and location. We put all of these things into a timeline. So this is what our timeline looks like over the course of 1 week. These are all the events that are happening. There's so much going on that not even all of it can be put into this same frame. So like the little dots that you can see at the top are ones that don't fit. The ones that are so much, the yellow stars with the black writing, are all about Michael Brown. So he was killed on August 9th, I believe. And so this is like within the next week of his death, how much stuff was happening. The red represents Ezell Ford and the blue-purple color is Eric Garner. To do all of this timeline, it took us over 50 hours between the two of us.
Some of our major findings we found was that the Black Lives Matter movement uses resource mobilization by using social media to connect and form as a movement. Resource mobilization refers to all activities involved in securing new and additional resources for your organization. It involves making better use of, maximizing, and existing resources. So in the Black Lives Movement, they use protests, videos, and posts on social media. They use meetings with criminal justice representatives, and they also use their longstanding organizations that were already in place. Another major finding was organizational readiness is evident in the Black Lives Matter movement. Because the movement already had connections through churches, businesses, and other social institutions. Organizational readiness describes organizations currently and potentially connected of the social movement and the accumulation of resources with a favorable political environment that improves groups' bargaining position. So as an example, you can look at the Black church during the civil rights movement. Another finding is that Black Lives Matter movement primarily facilitates their demonstrations and actions through social media and other social networks. They are able to reach a broad spectrum of people because their social media networks came before the Black Lives Movement started. And a major benefit from the Black Lives Movement is that all three leaders are trained organizers. And another major finding is the political opportunity structure. The political opportunity structure refers to the shifts in the political environment that affect the relative balance of power between elite and challenger groups and provide openings that allow the challenger groups to advance. These shifts in the criminal justice system and political responses to the Black Lives Movement and the attention they have received due to social media protests, news media attention, all resulting in positive change.
So if we look at these case by case, we call them advancements, or a lot of them are concessions throughout the criminal justice system that happened because of demonstrations. So in the Ford case, the officers were placed on administrative duty. The police department held a community forum, and they also ordered a release of the autopsy. Releasing autopsies are important because they can show certain data, such as if a person has gunshots to the underarm, it can show like he had his hands up while like he was getting shot. Or if there was shots to the back, it can show that he was not towards the officer when he was shot. And then they also sent the case to Internal Affairs. In the Robinson case, there's only one advancement, and that was that the Department of Justice led the case, which isn't really saying much considering there was a law in place that the Department of Justice was required to handle all use of force cases anyway. In the case of Tamir Rice, both officers were investigated by the department. The mayor apologized to the family for an ambulance bill that was titled defendant's last medical expense. It was for $500 for the ambulance trip after the police shot him. It should be noted that they didn't apologize for killing him, just for sending him the bill. And a $6 million lawsuit was settled. In the case of Eric Garner, the officer was placed on desk duty. The DA sent the case to the grand jury, and a mayor and archbishop met with the police and community minority leaders. The New York Police Department started training on how to properly use force, and a councilman proposed a bill to outlaw police chokeholds. The Attorney General reported that a criminal civil rights investigation was launched, and the government signed an executive order that the state Attorney General will review all cases of unarmed civilians killed by police. There are a lot of advancements through the Michael Brown case, so I'm gonna skip a couple of them. The Missouri Highway Patrol takes over supervising security in Ferguson, and the police chief gives most of his authority to the state troopers. This is important because in Ferguson, there was already tension between the community and the police before Michael Brown happened. And then, so if you take out what is like the problem and you put an outside perspective into it to help as like a neutralizing force, like that's a good thing, so you don't have a bias happening in your case. President Obama sent Federal Attorney General Holder to Ferguson to help. Mayor and city council meet with community members, which was something that wasn't happening before. The community wasn't getting a say in really anything, and that's why there was so much tension happening. And then the Ferguson officers started wearing body cameras, which is a huge advancement in policing. And then the DOJ Civil Rights met with 300 people. They were from the community, which is another good thing. The Ferguson police chief apologized for officers leaving Brown's body in the street too long after he was killed. Another side note, they also did not apologize for killing him, just for leaving his body in the street too long. The governor creates an independent commission to study social and economic conditions in Ferguson. We thought this was interesting because both the social and economic conditions were already happening in Ferguson. This didn't start after Michael Brown's death. So it helped to be a catalyst to start the change that was needed in this town. A black captain from the State Patrol was put in charge of restoring calm in Ferguson. He was the only person of color to be put in charge in this entire case. A commission was created to help Ferguson heal, and the governor appointed 16 citizens. Again, that's good. They're integrating the community into the government. And then Officer Wilson resigned, but the mayor announced there would be no severance. And a restraining order was granted against police, limiting their actions they can take against protesters. This was because police officers were using multiple chemical weapons to get protesters to disperse, but were not actually giving protesters time to disperse. They were just using them. So a judge ordered a 45-day hold on use of chemical weapons. So that was pretty cool. And then in our last case, the officer was charged and released on bail. This is the only case that the officer was immediately charged after the case, or after the incident happened. The North Carolina State Attorney handled the case. A police department investigation resulted in that the officer did not have the lawful right to shoot, and Cops and Barbers met with the community. Cops and Barbers was a program that was already in place to help bring the community and police together so they could have like good relations. So they continued meeting, and that was like a really vital thing to this case. Officers were suspended without pay, and the Internal Affairs started investigating, and then the state's attorney met with civil rights leaders.
Some of the limitations we found during the research process was that there was no single comprehensive source for the social movement demonstrations. So we used LFM to gather all the protests in our case, but LFM is limited to those protests in the name of hashtag Black Lives Matter. So while we were going through some Associated Press articles, we found some protests that were not already included in the literature, so we had to go ahead and add those. And then also, the Associated Press has fewer stories on lesser known cases. So in the example of Michael Brown, he was shot about a few days before Ezell Ford was. So this meant that Brown got most of the press, and most of the articles were on Brown and not Ezell Ford. Another limitation is that the Black Lives Movement is so vast, and it's so hard to track all of its actions.
So in conclusion, collective action by Black Lives Matter has led to criminal justice system concessions and Black Lives Matter advancements. So that's awesome. And we would like to thank our research assistants, Alex Olney and Grace Belton, as well as Dr. Logan, because this could not have happened without her. At this time, we'll take any questions anyone has.
I think oftentimes Black women are left out of the narrative of such, so I'm kind of curious why your research focused more on Black males rather than both.
There's a higher percentage of unarmed Black males killed than there are unarmed Black women, so that's why we went with Black males. This also was, like, the idea to do this research came from Terrence Crutcher's death in Oklahoma. Originally it was about, because if you know much about that case, he was shot and 3 days later the officer was charged, which is really quickly in the criminal justice system. And so my thought was the officer charged because she's a woman? Like, was it easier because it wasn't a white male for once? And so that's kind of what spurred it. So originally it was on a Black male, and so that also could have played into it. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you all for coming to our presentation.